Welcome, everyone. I'm Victor Perton from the Centre for Optimism, and John Anderson does not need a long introduction. A farmer, Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, and one of the most successful Deputy Prime Ministers in the history of the country, leader of the National Party. And when he retired from politics, he left full of optimism for the course in which Australia would travel. But recently, those of you who've read about what he's doing in the media, I know many of you are fans of his podcast and his interviews. There's a worry. You know, his optimism is nowhere near as clear, and he's re-entered public life to set a better course for the direction of the country. So John Anderson, welcome to the Centre for Optimism and an hour of optimism with John Anderson.
Very kind of you. My wife laughed because she's very much a glass half full. She thinks I'm often glass half empty, but I just say I'm a realist.
When you left politics, one of the things that was most evocative was that notion that you were very optimistic about the course of the country. And in fact, Malcolm Turnbull, when he retired as Prime Minister, made a very similar statement. So our first question to you, we've interviewed 12,000 people on what makes them optimistic, from presidents and prime ministers to people digging ditches in India. It's faith and it's belief in mankind, it's belief in science, it's love of family. John, what makes you optimistic?
Well, you mentioned faith. Your viewers and listeners will be aware that I do have a profound faith, and I do believe in grace, unmerited favour. So that gives me great personal optimism, and it's a particularly useful optimism, you see, because I've done nothing to deserve it. And I think that's a great thing. And a lot of hope revolves around, I think, things working out better perhaps than you're entitled to think that they might have worked out. And there's nothing like either extending that grace, if you like, to your children and your loved ones around you. There's a lot of hope and a lot of optimism in that. So relationally, I find life rich and fulfilling at every level. I often say that I'm an incredibly clever person who chose, and the evidence for this is that I chose my parents very wisely. They were Australian, and in fact, they were regional Australians. I mean, what more could you ask for? What an incredible country to live in. I mean, how fortunate are we? And I think over and above that, what I would say is, though, that the thing that worries me is, in fact, our lack of optimism and excitement and willingness to face challenges. You see, I think the default position for a lot of people is actually fear. I think fear really binds us up and it has us cowering in the corner. And it really worries me that we do face a lot of challenges at the moment. But imagine if Churchill and the Brits and the young pilots during those terrible days of August, September 1940 had said, oh, it's also hopeless. The numbers are against us. We've got 600 Hurricanes and Spitfires, and the Germans have got 4,600. We can never win, so we're not going to bother taking off. Now we're told 80% of our young people have varying degrees of anxiety about climate. If you dig into it, it's more than climate. Paradoxically, they're worried about jobs and having enough income to leave home and buy a home of their own. Well, you can either give in or you can say, these things look pretty daunting, but I'm going to have a go.
Yeah, no, it's spot on. And one of the things, we came out of the Australian Leadership Project. So we were bewildered by the negativity of Australians towards leadership. And obviously, political leadership, you joke about political leadership, whether you live in a dictatorship or a democracy. But for us, it was a darker, deeper anxiety about leadership. And as we interviewed people, we were left confounded. Such a good country, well led, from small NGOs and families through to the political leadership. We were left bewildered by that negativity. And so we decided that, in fact, the problem was not the problem of leadership, but the fog of pessimism. And hence the Centre for Optimism was born. So may we ask you, what makes you optimistic for Australia?
What makes me optimistic for Australia, as much as anything else, is that I think it was Margaret Mead who said, it only takes a few people to change the world. Indeed, it's never been any other way. And I see in Australia, that I see complacency and I see worse, cynicism. Skepticism's one thing about your political leaders. You want a degree of skepticism, but when it flows over, trips over into an unhealthy cynicism and a fear and a dislike and a distrust, it's crippling. You know, you get 2 or 3 people gathered together, and the first issue that arises in a way is, do I trust the others? If you do trust them, you can move forward together in harness, cooperation, better outcomes for everyone. If you decide you can't trust them, well, you flee for security. And security is the enemy of freedom. People don't realize that. We've seen it during COVID, actually. Our fears have meant we've want government to look after us, I think, too much so, in the sense that we've been prepared to let them really, I think, crack down on our freedoms too much. I'm not sure they're going to give them back to us unless we make a lot of noise. You know, it's really important to encourage those people who are saying, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. I'm going to break the mold. And funnily enough, the point at which I really felt encouraged in recent years about young people, because I think we've sold our young people a bit of a pup in many ways. We keep telling them our culture's no good, that they're inheriting something that's no good, that it's not worth defending. And a lot of them have bought it. We've sold them a pup and they've bought it. Does anybody understand that old expression, sold you a pup? That means sold you a dud. But they bought it. So we're both culpable. But, and some of you have heard me talk about this before. I'm sorry, people say I'm like a repeating record, but I was asked to compare a night with Jordan Peterson. I didn't even really know who Jordan Peterson was, but he was in Sydney. We go to the Chatswood Town Hall. It was good for my humility, because I mean, this guy, he's not a rock star, he's not a sports star. I'd never thought of him as a motivational speaker. He walked on and 1,000 people gave him a standing ovation. He spoke for 90 minutes, they gave him a second standing ovation. He took questions for 30 minutes, they gave him a third one. That's not the point of the story. The point of the story is that audience was packed with young people. Yeah. And his message was a tough one. It was, don't think an empathy culture, victimhood culture, all of these sort of modern trends are going to solve your problems or get you in touch with reality. You got to do it yourself. Go back into your bedroom. You've all heard that expression. Examine yourself. Have a long, hard look. You're not the person you ought to be. Resolve to be the most noble you can be, and then go back out and make a contribution to the world. And I looked around and I thought, hey, these are the same young Australians that would have been in the Cooee marches out in the bush in 1914. You know,
we're full of confidence in them, John. Someone sent me a picture today via LinkedIn. This is an academic whose children wrote on a footpath today, "What makes you optimistic?" in big print to inspire the local neighbourhood. So we've certainly got the 10 and the 12-year-olds there. But let's come to that question. In the introduction, I talked about Madeleine Albright, who describes herself as a worried optimist. So Australia 20 years ago was the most optimistic country in the Western world, along with New Zealand. And the best scientific evidence we've seen now says that personal optimism has dropped dramatically. So we're now middle of the ruck for Western countries. And at the same time, between 2006 and 2020, the number of people who are on antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs have doubled. So something is going on. And Rob Masters, who's the chairman of the Centre for Optimism, who you'd remember from your Canberra days, asks me often the question, what will it take to make Australia an optimistic country again? So what's your view on that, John? What will it take to have a resilient and optimistic population?
It'll mean a few things. I think, you know, the point about those young people was, you know, they can change the world. If they get together, they can push back the very best and change the world, because it's always, as Margaret Mead said, a few people getting together saying we've got to change direction. And my view of Australia is that the megaphones, the people with the voice in the public square now have been taken over by the people who would label themselves progressive, but actually they're quite profoundly down on our culture. They're constantly talking down everything we've done, everything we've achieved. They underestimate the importance of the freedoms we have. They certainly underestimate the prosperity we've enjoyed and attack its very foundations. And I think this relentless messaging has had a terrible effect. But the point is that there are alternative voices out there. You're part of that alternative voice mechanism. That's why, I'm honoured to be with you tonight. You're pushing back. You're saying this is hopeless. Look, again, go back to the boys in the Battle of Britain. What if they'd all just said, no, there's 4,600 Luftwaffe planes up there. We haven't got a hope. We're not getting in our Spitfire to go up there. And what happened? This is a perfect example. A couple of hundred young Brits, never in the history of human, whatever what the Churchill said, of so much being owed by so many to so few. And it will involve, I think, a radical reorientation of the way we think, and it will only be led by people who see that our current course of action, it's driven largely by fear. Yeah. And there's something else. There's something else. Thomas Sowell put his finger on it. I was quite intrigued at the time. He said that the problem is not that little Johnny can't think. Little Johnny can think. The problem is not that little Johnny can't feel. Little Johnny can feel. The problem is that little Johnny thinks feeling is thinking. Yeah. You see, we run on emotions all the time. We're psychological man. Who was it who said, I think, therefore I am? We now, I feel, therefore I am. And so we allow any gloomy facts or any rejection by other people that might make us feel hurt or harmed to destroy us. We say we self-identify, but only until others agree with us. And more often than not, they don't. They've got tough things to say. We have to be objective. We have to think. We have to reason, because as an eminent scientist friend of mine said, the end of the age of reason appears to be upon us. In the spirit of the Enlightenment, we've got to learn to think again. The Enlightenment, in my view, was flawed because it didn't deal with the problem of failure, of guilt, and of wrongdoing. It said we're all on the road to perfection, and now we suddenly feel we're so imperfect we don't want to defend our own culture. It's a massive switch you've been talking about. It's another way of just referring to that switch. Well, we've got to, again, with that one exception, I think, find our way to the best of the Enlightenment again. And I say that as a person of faith because it's often painted as opposed to faith. The true Enlightenment, particularly in Britain and America, was never opposed to faith. It worked with faith. It recognized that faith, true faith, will have you believing in a God who is a God of order, who thinks things can be discovered and unpacked and understood. Knowledge is, you can have knowledge without wisdom, but you can't have wisdom without knowledge. And at the moment, we're feeling our way to what we think is wisdom without facts, and we're ending up upside down in a ditch.
I saw a statistic the other day that said 90% of people who are concerned about climate change are not actually taking action on climate change. And, where you live, when I drive through that area, so many farms have got solar panels and, are so much part, of the renewable energy and the like. But one of our most popular activities, John, it doesn't matter whether it's a board meeting or school kids, I tell them to go and graffiti their mirror with "the leader looks like the person in my mirror." And I actually get people to get up and shout it out. And then I get people to look into each other's eyes and remind them that the leader looks like the person in your mirror. And then the other popular habit that we recommend to people is turn down the news. Doesn't matter whether it's the ABC or the commercial channels, 95% of news is bad. So people, well-informed people, as Rosling would say in his book, Factfulness, well-informed people regard the country as much worse off than it really is.
And the world.
Yeah. Now, Rob's got a really good question for you, picking up that point on trust.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Victor and John. One of the things you've said numerous words that really resonate with me. So I'd like to ask you a couple of questions around them. But just looking at trust in the first instance, where recent surveys have shown that trust in government has actually increased in the COVID period, and trust in public health science has also been a critical factor in that. But overall, trust in government has been a very negative position for most governments, either state, federal, or international, but they're a central component of effective government. So how do you see people having trust back into government? How should politicians try to restore trust in them and the way they go about their policies and the way they go about engaging with the public?
Well, it's critically important. And as you say, trust has been declining in government at a staggering level. There was a time when Americans revered the president, even if they hadn't voted for him, because he occupied the office of president. And that's all gone. If you come to Australia, the ANU's tracking polls showed that trust has been declining in the federal government since, of all persuasions, since about the research started in the early 70s. You used to get a big spike when there was a change of government. There was a huge one in 1996 when we came into government. By we, I mean the team I was part of. There was a bigger one when Rudd came to power. The last few elections, but then everything eases away again until there's another change. But the last few elections, there's no jump after an election in the trust of the people in government. Look, I think we've simply got to be more discerning and think this through. You see, what we've done in the age of identity politics is we've detached virtue from individuals and we've attached it to movements, to groupings and to movements. Oh. So once upon a time, a Menzies would say of his opposite number in the Parliament, and he went to, of course, Chifley's funeral in 1950 and wept, that we may have disagreed on policy, but he was a man of virtue. What did he mean by that? Well, virtue, the classic virtues were prudence, temperance, courage, moderation, and what have you. And then the classic Christian virtues were love, faith, and hope. But we don't talk like that about other people now. We attach virtue to a movement. So if you disagree with me on climate change, you're a non-person. You are not virtuous. I am virtuous, but you are not. Mm-hmm. And we're raising our children to believe that life is, as Jonathan Haidt puts it, a battle between good people and bad people. Well, no, a true understanding is a much more universalistic one. Every one of us has strengths and weaknesses. We can all learn from one another. None of us are perfect. None of us are completely beyond redemption. Now that's radical. Mm. But it was those thought processes, that universalism, it all, and Greg Sheridan writes in his book, The Man Who Changed Our Thinking Around This, was Paul in the New Testament, with his idea of universalism. You know, there's no longer man and woman, there's no longer Greek and Jew, there's no longer free and slave, we're all one in Christ. Everyone has value. Everyone has, has an obligation to recognize the values. Now, Menzies used to talk about this. We've washed that out of the system. Until we can learn to respect one another again and attach a recognition of virtue and be discerning about our leaders, I think we've got a real problem. Now, what can leaders do? Well, be virtuous. Be virtuous. Yep. And be straight and be trustworthy. You know, I don't know what more you've got to do. I mean, my personal view is I served with, had the great honour of serving with Peter Costello and John Howard. They were men who I believed you could trust. I could name many others. I trust the current Prime Minister. I believe he's a man of virtue. And even when I think I would have done something different, Scott, or I wish you'd do this, or I want to say I disagree with you, that's very different to saying I won't trust you. Because once that trust breaks down, the opportunity for cooperation and moving together starts to fail. That's a killer. Yeah. For democracy.
And it also picks up on values, personal values. Sorry. I was just going to say it also picks up on personal values. And And you use the word respect in that text as well. But I often find that how do you see the personal value that a person espouses or adheres to versus their political values, which can be contradictory in some cases?
Yes.
So how do you see that when you're looking at a leadership situation where you're expecting hope, light at the end of the tunnel, lead us through? Because we all know that if you don't follow or if you don't deliver on hope, it undermines optimism.
Well, it does, and it undermines trust. And when trust's undermined, freedom is undermined. Yep. And the illustration I use of that is the Royal Commission of Inquiry into the banking and financial sector, services sector. It established in the mind of the public that you can't trust bankers, so we need 72 new sets of laws and regulations, plus machinery to police it and then punish it and all the rest of it. And we've lost freedom. There was a time when you trusted bankers. The AMP was a byword for trust in the Australian community for decades, as Geoffrey Blaney, its official historian, points out. It was an enormously, one of the most trusted institutions in the country. By the time the Royal Commission was over, nobody trusted it. It was smashed. Right. Why? Yep. Because, when it was trusted, by the way, there was very little regulation in this country, but people were discerning. They knew by the behaviour and the way that its leaders acted and it performed its duties, you could trust the AMP. Now you have to coerce them to result. A whole lot more laws and regulations, so banking's become harder. So it's harder now to start a new business, for example. It actually is. I know that from personal experience. Quite interesting. New prudential arrangements have made banks so cautious that they're backing away from funding innovation and new ideas. Who loses? We all lose. Why? Because trust broke down. Why did trust break down? People didn't do what they ought to have done without coercion.
I'd like to also get your thoughts on empathy, where they're now a call on leaders to show greater empathy, but in delivering on empathy, they can also expose their vulnerabilities. And so they're two different things. So do you think that holds back on the way they should go about trying to engage with people?
I think politicians, when they're asked to do empathy, are often at their most superficial and untrustworthy sort of levels. I really do. Sympathy is one thing. You can sympathise with somebody and say, I'm sorry about your plight, but I'm going to tell you the truth. It's not the government's fault. It's something you should be doing something about. Empathy insists in its modern language that I identify with you and it's never your fault. And it plays into the victim culture thing. Oh, you're a victim. I'm so sorry. Now everyone has to be a victim because that's how you get affirmation. Everybody's required to empathise with you. So sympathy is important. Empathy is one of those emotive things that will often mean that you're not able to pursue the facts and the evidence and the truth vigorously enough to be able to resolve a situation. That sounds harsh. It's not meant to be. It's an acknowledgement. Sometimes the truth hurts, but often the truth has to be spoken in love. And indeed, I heard someone say, just because I disagree with you doesn't mean I don't love you. It may even be because I do love you. But now we say, unless you're affirming me, you're my enemy and you lack virtue and you're a horrible person. And at the rate we're going, honestly, I mean, some young people now are so devoid of hope, they cast their minds around and say, well, now how do I become a victim? Because that's how you get affirmation. I can go online and whatever my problem is, there'll be somebody out there who'll give me affirmation. They'll empathize with me, but they'll never say, no, hey, listen, wake up to yourself. That's not a way forward. There are times when that would be gratuitous and wrong because somebody is a genuine victim. But as we well know, we're often responsible for the plight we get ourselves into. And the most loving thing that can happen to us is for somebody to say, snap out of it, mate.
And do you think that would lead into them actually exposing their vulnerabilities as well? Or do you think that's asking too much of leaders?
Politicians, of leaders? We live in the age when people expose their vulnerabilities. It's an interesting one, isn't it? I'm not sure that it does help. I think we want our leaders, they should show sympathy. I'm all for sympathy. I worry about empathy when it's concocted as it has to be. I know I've been an MP. I've been confronted with situations where people just want me to totally empathize with them. It's all completely their fault. And they've had some terrible marriage breakup. It was all the other partner's fault. I didn't do anything wrong. I expect you to absolutely accept my story. You see the point?
Yeah.
It might be wiser to be able to say, look, I'm really sorry for the situation you're in. I'm really concerned about your plight. But have you considered that loading yourself up with that hatred and that irrationality is actually destroying you? I'm just using it as an example.
Yeah.
So I think we need to always ensure that the will and the heart and the mind line up, and that the way in which we respond is based on evidence and an understanding of the facts and of received wisdom, if I can put it that way, the wisdom of the ages. One of the great and concerning things now is I think a lot of young people have been convinced that no one over the age of 40 has learned anything, and that the people who are in the grave, well, they were all dunderheads. They were all living in a more simple and basic age, whereas all of the great questions of the human condition have been agonized over for centuries, and we're very unwise to have to try and relearn everything.
Very true. I'd just like to ask one more question. I don't want to dominate, but and you mentioned fear, and we all know in politics that the climate of fear is often a way of actually getting people to react in that. But how do you see, because you mentioned before that fear binds us up, and therefore we don't act the way we should. But a lot of politicians love putting the community in that. And you could say during the COVID period now, there has been a climate of fear created with numerous people around vaccination and whether I'm going to get this virus or not. So how do you see us moving out of that type of thinking into a more optimistic world that we should be pursuing? Because I note that in the UAE and in Singapore, they actually have departments of happiness. So they actually go out there and promote happiness as a cultural outlook as far as their people are concerned. And the fear element may be there, but it's not shown the way we operate.
I do think a big part of the answer is to try and recapture again the age of reason. You see, fear is an emotion. It's not always rational. It's often very irrational. It can be the only appropriate response, but to give way to it is almost never the right response. You won't, though, deal with fear unless you actually know the facts. So if you take the climate change thing, I'm a farmer. I'm always been interested in agricultural policy as well as farming itself. We feed the people. And one of the first and most basic questions to ask about climate change modelling is, will we be able to feed ourselves? Now, the climate has been volatile, we're told now, for quite some time, and certainly it has been in Australia. I'm not going to deny that. And yet agricultural production's continued to rise here and globally. Farmers have adapted. They've been very innovative. For the last 10 years, someone mentioned Rosling's fascinating book, people have no idea how much progress we've actually made. They always get the wrong end of the stick on how bad things are. The last 10 years, here's a cause for optimism. It's quite a staggering thing. The world's farmers have produced enough food every year in the last 10 years, not for the global population of 7.5 million people or whatever it is, but for 10 billion people. 10 billion. There's a lot of food that goes to waste because of politics and poor infrastructure and waste in wealthy societies where, I went to a big function before lockdown where there were 300 people and we were given a finger lunch, and it was the most delicious finger lunch I've ever had, and I ate 3 times as much as I needed or wanted and felt uncomfortable, and then went out the back to thank the people who'd put it together. It was a big function. and there was bag after garbage bag of wasted sandwiches and finger food, delicious food. It was all going to be thrown away. And I thought, as a farmer, I really have a problem with this.
I'd recommend to everyone, if they haven't seen it, your interview with Bjorn Lomborg on climate change, because I found that a most insightful discussion, and his views and your views on what we have achieved as far as climate is concerned, and the innovation that has gone into a lot of the work.
Well, if you take farming, I'm actually not a farmer who thinks that we should exempt agriculture, because emissions, feeding people from paddock to plate, if I can put it that way, probably produces about a third of the world's emissions. But actually, people forget that farmers are recyclers of carbon. We emit carbon and we absorb it growing food. And if we can keep a bit more of it in the soils, if we can find better ways to do our cattle work and what have you, you'll be astonished at what agriculture can actually achieve. It really can. It turns out that at this stage, I'm actually optimistic, to use the word in your title, that beef will turn out to be a part of the actual answer to absorbing carbon. There you go. There's something radical, such as the movement of technology in that area. And it's actually going to make farming cattle, in appropriate circumstances, probably more profitable, probably give higher quality meals, and actually help absorb more carbon. So there you go, from one extreme to the other. But you would think, from the public in the information that's out there, or the way it's distorted and the way emotions run on it, that it was the worst thing you could possibly do, is to sit down and eat a steak. Well, facts actually, when you assemble them and when you're actually aware of how fast moving this area is, would suggest that it may not be so.
Thank you for that. I think Dean's got a question to ask you.
Hi, John. Good to see you again. And just a quick question, I guess. Overnight, in the last 24 hours, it seems to me that the Victorian Coalition has a breath of fresh air, a new leader in Matthew Guy, who was a former leader and is back again. And I guess, using some of your sort of Churchillian type language, you know, we're in a dire state here in Victoria. Not only are we, I think we're the second most locked down city in the world.
Yeah, after Brazil.
After Brazil, but the Premier has effectively shut down Parliament and said, "Oh, the opposition is not even relevant." So my question, I guess, is, you know, how can a coalition, you know, a party room, present a real alternative to what has become a totalitarian regime here in Victoria that basically doesn't, you know, they're happy to shut down schools, shut down businesses, shut down whatever it takes, with no end date in sight?
It's a very good question, and it's very concerning, because one of the things that you can't help noticing is that many of today's elites are quite, at heart, profoundly anti-democratic. They think they know best. And the other line that you get is that, you know, the progressive view is accepted by the majority of people. It's won out, and therefore there's no need to worry. It's the right course of action. You do get that in academia quite a bit. My response is a very simple one. You never get good public policy without a good quality debate. If a debate is silenced, if it's truncated, if it's distorted, if it's not based on evidence and reality, and if it's not respectful, you will not get quality policy. And it's worth considering that. I did see some research. I wish I could find it again. I can't. But some research which really strongly hinted that the Australian people, when they stopped to think about it, believe the last time we had a high quality debate, boots and all, but it was a real debate that resulted in a real change, was the introduction of a new tax system in 1999. That's 21 or 22 years ago. So a poor quality debate will not produce good policy. How long since we've had good policy in this country? It's a long time. So yeah, look, I look on and wonder why on earth there's any support left, to be honest, for the Premier of Victoria. I know that's a political statement. I'm really sorry. I don't mean to be party political. I'm a great respecter of a lot of people that I saw on the other side of the parliament to me. And Kim Beazley and I are very good friends. He mightn't like me to say that, having just had a go at Dan Andrews, one of his ilk. But I really do worry about the way he's approached all of this. I worry about it deeply. Patronising people is appalling, and denying them the opportunity to ask questions means that they won't own the decisions that you make. How can the Premier of Victoria expect his decisions to be respected if a great chunk of the population feels they've not been consulted, not had a chance to answer questions? You won't own decisions that are forced on you if you've not been able to contribute or ask questions.
I agree.
John, can I introduce you to Noreen, who's created Project Optimism, which is an animated course on the habits of an optimist.
That'd be interesting. I'd love to see that.
Oh, how you can learn to be optimistic. Yes. I love this discussion, John. I really love how you've approached inclusion and diversity through the only way possible, and that is through fair and respectful discussion. My question, obviously I'm a new Australian, and I found one thing when I came to Australia that I noticed people weren't speaking up as much, and they weren't defending, as you say, their land and their culture as much. And I mean, even in a respectful way, I sort of people are held back due to perhaps the judgments that are out there, the way social interaction has changed. And I feel you're so right. I mean, nothing can really happen well and progressive unless everyone is involved in the discussion, right? Whether it's political. And the one thing I would say about what our Premier is doing at the moment is just that he's just mean to us from the podium. He's just mean, you know, like there's that as well coming on. There's not, okay, fine if you're in charge, but just be nice to people. You know, we're all going through a hard time. I just feel there's no niceness there. That's the point I would make about what's happening at the podium from him at the moment. But getting back to the discussion and equality and a real exchange of hearts and minds, which is the best way that people can progress discussions. I feel, how do we do that optimistically? How can we do that? How can we ask for a fair seat at the table to give our very right-wing, you know, sort of view on things, or a very left-wing view on things without being made wrong? I mean, how do we bring about a culture of that? How can we do it optimistically?
I think humbly is the only way. What do I mean by that? We all get on our high horses so quickly. We're so judgmental of people who have a different view that we just seek to shut them down. The old adage that I'll defend to the death your right to say, even if I disagree with you. I may disagree with you, but I'll defend your right, the death, the right you're to say it. It's now, if you dare to disagree with me, I will fight to the death to ensure that you're not heard. And it's hopeless. And I think the only way I can answer the question, because it's a very good one and it troubles me deeply, and I try to model civil conversation in the conversations I have, and people say, oh, you only talk to right-wingers. I don't. Some of the people that a good third at least of the people that I talk to would not regard themselves as centre or right of centre. They would regard themselves as left of centre. But the thing they have in common is that they believe in debate and they believe in the facts. You can only have a debate if you actually have the evidence with you. I was amazed to see a journalist in Crikey say that I only interview right-wingers, such as the boy crisis, Warren Farrell in America. Warren Farrell ran for Democrat governorship of California. He was a supporter of Hillary Clinton and of gun reforms. The only area in which he's a conservative is on family values. So you see, the progressives will label anybody who disagrees with any part of their Bible.
It's scary. It's scary.
Scary right-wing sort of troglodytes. And I said to Warren, as a left-wing person and America's leading feminist, because that's the way he's usually described, male feminist, do you find that the left of centre media will talk to you? And he said, I'll get calls. And then as soon as we talk about family, they'll say, oh, no, we're not interested, and it breaks my heart, he said, as someone from the left, that it's only conservative news outlets and they're at me all the time. They're always wanting me on. Well, what's happened? What has happened? For another brilliant critique, go to Melanie Phillips. Now, she's identified as right-wing and she'd call herself right-wing, I think now, but she came from the left. And she's a fascinating and lovely person and very powerful mind. She wrote a book, Guardian Angels, My Journey from Leftism to Sanity. And she makes the same point, that once the left, for example, cared deeply about family, was always talking about the importance of family. Once it didn't suit people of the left because they were smashing up their own personal relationships to talk about family, they turned on family. Now they won't discuss the evidence. And she describes the searing experience of finding that her articles, which were based on left-wing research into the cost of family breakup, were not being published and not popular because her editors regarded them at The Guardian as hurtful. Well, hang on, that's a feeling. Journalism's about objectivity. What's happened? So we have to be, I think, humble, not on ourselves, so that we're not the problem. And if you like, we heap coals on the heads of others by saying, being the models of reasonableness and trying to enter into reasoned debate. Often questions are the best way. Is that what you believe? Why do you believe that? What is the evidence for it? What does it mean? Where will it take us? And sometimes you'll find the arguments fall apart very, very quickly.
Very helpful stuff. Thank you, John. That was great. I'm going to pass you on to Kay now for her question.
Hi, John. My name is Saeed Alam. Thank you so much for gracing this occasion with your presence.
Next to ask a question, I'll call you up, Saeed. Saeed's beaming in from Pakistan, John.
Hello, Saeed. We'll look forward to talking.
But Saeed, I'll call you up after the others. Okay.
Hello, John. Nice to see you.
And you?
What really resonates with me is you talking about how do we role model and how do we behave in a way that we want others to behave. And what I'm passionate about is what I call your ripple. I think the words you say and the actions you take have lasting impact beyond the moments in which you speak them and take the actions. So my question to you is around how do we balance now the messages we're giving and the ripple we create when social media is shaped the way it is, and to use your words from earlier, when they are quite affirmation based, you know, so many of the social media tools that are used now by our future leaders are based around how many likes I get and did I get lots of responses and do you believe in me and do you agree with me? So how do we, recognizing that those are the platforms that are currently in play and are having much wider reach than the way we used to do things, how do we use them to the good to get really good and congruent messaging that is reflective of who we are and the way we want to behave? How do we do that, John?
I wish I knew. I'm not an expert at it. I mean, my own website is an attempt to enter that space and to do everything I can to lift the tone and to try and ensure that people are given a chance. People who wouldn't otherwise be heard are heard. And there are a lot of people starting to do that now, and it's become very popular, but in a way it's become divisive because people then, they polarize to whoever agrees with them.
Yes.
So I try and force myself to hear what the other side is saying. It's usually not very difficult because it's preached at me all the time by most of the major media outlets and by a lot of the young people that I run into. Not all of them. As I said earlier, I'm so struck by the courage and the clarity of insight of some of the cream of our young people. I really am. I just think it's astounding. And it'll need to be. They'll need to be courageous as well. But I'm going to be really honest with you and say I'm grappling with the question just as you are. I can only try and model to the best of my ability a better way. That in itself sounds proud. No, I've had to learn that a big key to all of this is to recognize the greatest trap I can fall into is to be as self-righteous and as smug as many of those people who think, the technocrats I call them, who think they know better than us. And unfortunately now government is increasingly run by technocrats. And we're hollowing out the public service as well. So it's often technocrats from the private sector who provide endless consultancies at vast expense to the taxpayers and say, well, doing what once the public service would have done themselves. So we've got ourselves in a difficult position. But the encouraging thing is that there is tremendous pushback. You're part of it. Centre for Optimism says it all. I mean, I hear what you're saying. There's a movement out there that will preserve an understanding of what liberty is, even if we go through some dark days before people start to look for it again. Remember, during the Middle Ages, the way in which learning and understanding and sound theology and things were kept alive in Ireland. Bless them. Yeah. And all of that repository of wisdom was there as people started to look for better ways again. And it'll come. The time will come.
Thank you so much, John. Saeed, you're up.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Peter, John and Victor. My question to you, why did you go into politics? What makes a good leader and how do you describe your leadership style?
Well, I'm always reluctant to talk about my leadership myself. It's never wise to commentate because somebody will immediately point out why you're wrong. And when you say you did something the right way, they'll say, no, you did it the wrong way. And they're probably right half the time. I went in, I was talked into it. I literally was. I'd not contemplated. Had you once told me I'd end up being a federal member as a young man, I would have fallen over backwards. If you'd told me I'd end up a cabinet minister, I'd have been amazed. If you'd told me I'd end up acting deputy and then acting prime minister during 9/11, for example, I would have said, you've been on the Kool-Aid. But, you know, and Jordan Peterson refers to this, young men in particular just need some encouragement. And I was encouraged. People came to me and said, look, we think you've got something to give. Older men who I respected. And we must never forget that. Perhaps that's part of the answer that I've left out to some of the earlier questions. Our job in engaging with and mentoring and just encouraging and being there for young people, our own and their friends and the ones that you meet. And I meet quite a few through the podcasts that I do. You know, our responsibility to be friends with them, to be encouragers, to seek to encourage their strengths and help them identify their weaknesses. These things are gold. And part of our problem, you see, is that we've not respected our elders. We've broken down the mechanisms in our culture for passing on the wisdom of the ages. I would posit that no society that has cut itself off from the wisdom of the ages has ever remained in good order for very long. As Os Guinness puts it, we are in danger of becoming a cut flower society. We've removed ourselves, we've snipped ourselves off from the vines and the branches and the roots and so forth that grew us and sustained us. We're in a vase. Every hot wind that blows, we wilt a bit more and take longer to recover. Every cold wind that blows, same thing. We need to reattach ourselves to the sustaining well springs of freedom and of hope.
We're so fortunate, John. We've got from Pakistan to the United States and to France, etc., have all beamed in. They admire you, John, and we've promised others will send them the video. Can I call up Peter Kronborg, who is one of the country's leaders in positive governance for corporations? And you'll have to unmute, Peter. It's the Oxford Dictionary new entry.
Of course, an old trick for a new starter. Hey, thank you very much, Victor. Thank you, John. Terrific. I'd just like to depoliticize it a bit. It seems to me that we've got a problem here that's systemic in Australia, as we do have in democracies around the world, where the democracies have been hijacked to a considerable extent by exaggerated party politics. And the exaggeration comes from social media and mainstream media now that has so much more power than it used to have. So what I'd like to see, is there a way for us to shift from reactionary politics, which we see embraced so frequently in question time and Parliament, to visionary politics? And my hypothesis, proposition, is that we actually can't do that in Parliament House. I think that now our model of Parliament is so polarised that we're not going to be able to really get to focusing on the big issues outside. And that equally outside, we do focus on big issues sometimes. And I think in two areas. One is think tanks, where there's a lot of thinking about the future of Australia, in other countries of the world. But the think tanks are highly politicised, so they tend to be from that side or that side. So I don't think our think tanks are the way forward. And I think that the Royal Commissions we have sometimes delve into the bigger issues, but they are really there dealing with problems and how we're going to deal with the banks when they've gone off track, aged care when it's gone off track, violence against women, children, and so forth. So they're problem-focused commissions. I'd like to propose that we actually have Future Australia as a commission of thought to bring together thinkers, advocates, leaders, to really focus on the big things for Australia's future. I'm not too sure they will actually come to the final 10 recommendations that will make Australia a better thing. It's more in the line of the South African Commission for Truth and Reconciliation. So it wasn't about blame, it was about future, and it was about allowing voices to spread and a thousand poppies to grow, so to speak. So is there a place potentially for us to actually have a discussion where thoughts can be brought forward in that positive, constructive mode without political point scoring going on, and we could focus on some big things like society. What is the shape of society we want in the future? Environment. What is the truth about how we can create a better environment, a sustainable environment in the future? Economy. What is the balance between the various labours of capital, labour, finance, and social value? And finally, that one of social values and morality. What is it that actually epitomises the Australia we'd like to see in 2050? So sure, have the conversation about zero carbon, which needs to happen more in the next 10 years, not in the next 30 years. But let's talk about these big things in a positive, non-political environment where it is a politics-free zone, if that's at all possible. But we do have the leading thinkers brought together in a very positive, constructive way. Your thoughts on that, John?
It's a good question. I agree with much of what you've said. In a way, though, I'm going to suggest that the answer is probably best found by having a bit of a look at how we did it in the past and how we do it now. That'll sound a strange thing to say. I think what's happened is that all the major three political philosophies and their frameworks have deteriorated to the point of meaningless in Australia. So you had your classic left of centre democratic socialists, the Labor Party, and there was a nobility about many of them. You think of a man like Bob Baldwin, who I have an utmost respect for. Now, he would have seen himself as a left-wing member of Bob Hawke's cabinet, but I might have disagreed with his policies, not his objectives, which were what he would have called universalism. He wanted to ensure that all Australians were fully recognised, paid-up members of the Australian family. So noble objective, but I disagreed with his ways of wanting to get there. Then you had your classic liberals, who were people who believed in small government and a civic society, very appealing and particularly strong on free enterprise, and the more extreme of them, laissez-faire, whereas most of us are mixed economy people. We want some sensible guidelines and rules and regulations. And then you had your classic conservatives. Now, what am I saying? I'm saying that the contest of ideas, rather than of personality politics, meant that each of them could argue out their vision for Australia, and then the voters could choose. You see what I'm saying? And they could test the policies that came up to the parliament against that long-term view of where they thought Australia could go and argue the case. As it's broken down, the Australian people are not being offered choice. That's one problem. Then their cynicism and their breakdown of trust is being fed by what emerges from that, which is that politicians look increasingly like their decisions are ad hoc and managerial rather than visionary. And that's because they're not visionary. So my worry with your solution, I understand exactly what you're driving at, and I want the same outcome. But at the moment, you see it'd be dominated by the activists. So, you know, the overwhelmingly, the numbers are staggering. Academia now is of one political view. You know, very, very few people in academia now who would defend a libertarian or a classic conservative position. They're the only three that I really understand as being relevant for Australia, and being able to sort of set out a goal. And the voters need a choice so they can hear the arguments. And the arguments used to be vicious, but I quoted Menzies and the way he wept at his opponent's funeral in 1950. It was very real. They were close personally. There was no animosity or tearing down of one another. It was more a contest of ideas. And that's what we need. Vigorous contest of ideas and a debate that's quality. To go back to my theory, you'll never get quality policy if you don't have quality debate. So I understand exactly what you're saying, but my worry is the activists would get control of any sort of future Australia at the moment. And the way the activists operate at the moment, it's all emotion. There's not enough attention to facts.
So, John, we promised an hour of optimism. If you'll take one more question, so we might just click over the hour, but Peter's actually acting as well. So Peter's actually going to be running an Asia Pacific Summit on positive governance. So it's something that intrigues me, and I'm really looking forward to supporting him in that. Marie, would you like to ask the last question, and then we'll do a general thank you.
Thank you. Now, John, I was elected in 1996 in the Victorian Parliament about 30 days after you came to government. And at the time I think he was about 12 months old, my son, then went on to have a baby in Parliament. There's been so much debate lately about the treatment of women in that environment. And there's been a code of conduct, a model code of conduct submitted to the Human Rights Review to Kate Jenkins by the ANU, the Global Institute of Women's Leadership, which is Julia Gillard. And it's all around how every individual is treated in the house. Have you seen a decline in the past 25 years? I've been reflecting on 25 years since I was elected, a decline in the standards in the Parliament. And what I'm actually interested in and doing, I'm doing a Master of Leadership at the moment, is how women are, how we can make it less gender-based on the floor of the Parliament, which is terribly combative, and women are either not heard or they need to screech if they're, you know, in that question time environment. And part two of that question is also sort of about respect and honesty, and that is with politicians from each state and territory slagging off against each other and the federal government. We discussed earlier that there's more trust in government during COVID, but do you think that the Commonwealth as a whole, with all of this bickering going on between the leaders and accusing each other of dishonesty, is going to affect our Commonwealth model moving forward? So there are sort of two questions there. One, model code of conduct which will be more respectful to women in the Parliament, and two, politicians being a model, a leadership model for people in the general community in the way they conduct themselves, honesty, integrity, and respectfully.
Well, to take the question in two parts, yes, I think there has been a decline, and ironically, more women in Parliament has not arrested the decline. I think it's fair to say that. But I think it reflects the way in which we become a dog eats dog society. And I like the analogy that we live in a garden in a jungle, that the West you know, and Australia was the beneficiary of being able to put together the very best of the British and the American approaches when we designed our federal constitution. And that garden was based on the idea that we drop identity politics. See, identity politics is not new. It's the default position. We club together with others that we might be able to feel confident will look after us, and we can fight for them and they'll fight for us. And everybody else is our enemy. That's the jungle. The garden was when we decided, no, the universalist model that Sheridan talks about from the Apostle Paul, we must respect one another despite our differences. We're all one, actually, in the eyes of the Almighty. Because that was the sort of influence, I think, in the West, this extraordinary idea that gave rise to the rule of the law, you know, all in the common law, the king must obey the same laws that the peasant has to obey, and vice versa. That created a garden. Now we've stopped tending the garden. We've started to behave more like the jungle. The weeds are encroaching because we fight one another, and that spills over into our parliaments. And then we think the answer is more regulations. Well, I go back to what I said about banking. Much better that people behave properly and respectfully. I mean, the belting I would have got from my father, I don't mean that physically, but he would have absolutely let me have it if I had been disrespectful in his presence to someone of the opposite sex. Unbelievably so. And I was expected to step aside, you know, for people who are older, or people who, you know, for women, or at the door, or whatever, and those sorts of things. They mattered. It was drilled into me deeply. That you must not be on yourself. You must not take it upon yourself to be abusive of somebody else or disrespectful. Now, all of that's breaking down, and it's playing out in our parliaments. And the camaraderie is breaking down as well. You see, it's not just the levels of politeness. The camaraderie's gone. I've seen that in the federal parliament. I've had people who've been around, who were there when I was there, saying all the camaraderie's gone. People don't even eat together at lunchtime. Now, as to your the second part of your question, just jog my memory again.
Well, there's the code of conduct for women. So how women are treated on the floor of the parliament, You've answered that. The second is really the combativeness between our leaders, and whether you feel that after
the Commonwealth. Yes, I think the Commonwealth is being damaged.
Uncomplicate it and just have a normal background.
I think the Commonwealth is being badly damaged, and I'm very worried about it. I think people are failing to identify as Australians first. We're all in this together, and we need to come out of it together. We need to put our country back together. And I think what is happening at the moment is very concerning indeed.
Thank you, John.
I think you're muted.
Look, thank you so much, John. This has been absolutely fantastic. You can see there's still many, many more questions to be asked. And I'd just like to ask a young man on, we talked about youth, to do the final thank you to you, and to thank everyone else who has participated. And I've just there here, sorry, I just... So Ted Perton's going to say a thank you to John and to all the other participants.
Thank you, Victor. As I said, I normally run the Centre for Optimism Zoom technical thing, so apologies if there's been some technical difficulties tonight. But John Anderson, thank you so much. Your wisdom has been profound. So on behalf of all of us at the Centre for Optimism, the extended following, and I guess everyone here tonight, thank you so much. We look forward to working with you in the future, but your wisdom has been really impactful. I think everyone here tonight can attest. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you for your energy, and thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it immensely.
Yeah, we you have lots and lots of fans here, and fans all around the world. So I think if everyone wants to do a wave to John and a thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thanks.
What's the best way we can support your work, John?
Just click on and encourage your friends to.
Yeah. No, we'll do that. I think that we've had lots and lots of positive comments. And have you got 1 minute more for one quick question?
Yeah.
Wayne Larkin, you were going to ask a question and you're patient for half an hour.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. And thank you, John. It's been excellent listening to you. The question was, in Australia, how do we create protection of human rights against a movement of what we're seeing of totalitarian rule, tippy-toeing in to control the people and the sponsorship and editing of the window to the world through big tech and media and political control of information, creating fear on people and making us, I think, move in the wrong direction.
The Dying Citizen, Victor Davis Hanson, I think, is about to publish a book at the end of next month called The Dying Citizen. What he's talking about is the way in which the middle classes, which are the great bulwark against extremes from at either end and from the top and the bottom of society, the great middle classes, 70, 80% in the middle, they need to be empowered, they need to be informed, they need to be skeptical but not cynical, they need to recognise and reward trustworthy behaviour and to call out bad behaviour, but they can't do it if they've not been, well raised and well educated. I think your question's a very good one. I don't have a glib answer. All I can say is that every single one of us needs to club together, just as you people have tonight, to talk about these things, to identify the dangers, and then with humility but with courage, push back, and often asking the hard questions is really important. But Os Guinness makes the comment that we don't talk enough about our great freedoms, freedom of belief and conscience, freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, the right to meet or not to meet, to discriminate in whom we will meet with, and to choose who we will not meet with. And of course, we all discriminate. Every time you have a dinner party and invite some people but not others, you are discriminating. But we've painted the word now to sort of mean something that it is so dreadful and so evil and so incomprehensible that it's meaningless but dangerous, if you know what I mean. We don't talk about those. We don't educate our people that they're a very hard one. If they're lost, they will never be recovered. They are worth defending. So our young people now, and you can actually trace this in the data, have moved to a position of saying, no, free speech is not the great priority that people say it is. What should be allowed is appropriate speech. Who decides what's appropriate speech? The mob will always silence the unpopular opinion. The minute you silence the unpopular opinion, you're cutting short the very thing I said at the beginning, quoting Margaret Mead. The only, it only takes a few people to change the direction of a society. Indeed, it's the only way it ever happens. So we've got to keep our right to speak, our right to freedom of conscience and belief, and our right to assembly. There's no hierarchy. They're a club. They go together. They're all in or they're all out. We have to keep them intact. And we've got to push back against the idea that we guarantee our freedoms with regulations, starting with the sex discrimination machinery that Whitlam started to put in power. Now we compete for our human rights against other people's human rights. We've dropped the language of respect, cooperation, and dare I say it, loving thy neighbour. And we think we can coerce people to change their attitudes when in fact we can't. I could go so far as to say we need to be renewed by or remade by the renewing of our minds.
Excellent. Thank you, John.
Thank you again.
John's had a very long day. So we've had a few questions on what platforms John's on. So he's very modern. He's on YouTube. There's a website, John Anderson. It's .net, isn't it, John?
Yes, johnanderson.net.au.
johnanderson.net.au. He's also on Twitter. He's also on Facebook. So you can follow him in any medium. And, just rewatching the videos today in preparation, John, just so full of wisdom and joy and energy. So I think appropriately, blessings to you.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it enormously.
Thanks, John. Bye, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye. Thank you.
Well, we hope you enjoyed that hour of optimism with John Anderson. We'd love you to get involved with the Centre for Optimism. You'll see the website on the screen, centreforoptimism.com. Sign up for our free newsletter, or better still, sign up as a member or a supporter. And we look forward to you joining us many times over the years to come.